The night smelled of fuel and rain. June 1944. Near St. Lo, a B-17 had fallen like a burning constellation, its frame twisted into the French soil. Among the wreckage, 3 Wehrmacht engineers moved cautiously, their boots crushing glass and shell casings. Engineer Otto Hahn, formerly a radio specialist from Dresden, noticed a faint blue pulse flickering under a panel of scorched aluminum. It was the aircraft's radio, half melted yet still alive. He bent closer. Static hissed through the charred speaker. Then, through the smoke, a fragile human voice broke free. "We're still here. Red lead, red lead." Then silence. For a full 10 seconds, no one spoke. A voice from the dead had just traveled through the ashes. Hahn whispered, "The machine is still speaking." His superior, Lieutenant Karl Bremer, wrote in his notebook, "Signal survived impact. Duration, 19 seconds. Source, unknown frequency." The Germans had seen countless weapons, but never one that could die and still talk back. Around them, the crash site glowed faintly, ammunition still ticking under heat, parachute silk fluttering like ghosts among the hedgerows. They dismantled the radio on site, shielding it from rain with their coats. The casing was stamped SCR-299, U.S. Army Signal Corps. Its circuits were arranged not like a weapon, but like a nervous system. Wires pulsing in rhythm, tubes humming even after power failure. Bremer murmured, "It's like a heart refusing to stop." Later, at the field station, the engineers tested the remains. Against all odds, the receiver emitted one more burst of life. Faint Morse beeps repeating, "Eacum, RED." They could not locate the origin. Perhaps another bomber, perhaps an echo caught in the ionosphere. But to Hahn, it sounded like a heartbeat that had refused extinction. By morning, word spread among nearby units. An American radio had spoken after death. Soldiers came to look. Some laughed, others crossed themselves. Hahn only said one sentence before closing the crate. "If this is how they communicate, no wonder they never feel alone." The discovery would travel to the Luftwaffe's technical division in Paris, along with a report marked "Urgent, Psychological and Strategic Value Unknown." In the distance, Allied bombers droned like thunder, each one carrying its own network of voices across the sky, voices that could outlive the flesh that made them. A voice that refused to die, a signal that outlasted fire. That night, for the first time, German engineers began to suspect that the real artillery was not steel, but sound. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is right now, because somewhere, another signal is still traveling through the dark. In a dim workshop outside Paris, the captured radio sat like a heart waiting to be dissected. Major Ernst Keller, commander of the Luftwaffe's Technical Analysis Unit, leaned over the workbench while his engineers unbolted each panel. The smell of hot solder and damp wool filled the room. Around him, the rhythmic tick of typewriters recorded every measurement: tube resistance, circuit alignment, modulation bandwidth. But something else caught Keller's attention: the microphone. He lifted it carefully, burn marks along its edge, yet the cable remained intact. The small switch beneath the trigger wasn't standard issue. Hahn adjusted his spectacles and whispered, "Herr Major, this one has a feedback coil. It listens." Keller frowned. "Listens? Explain." "It's not just for transmitting. This model can receive at short range, half-duplex communication, two-way, instant response." A long silence followed. Keller's men looked at one another, understanding the implication before anyone dared to speak. In the Reich, communication was command and obedience. One spoke, the rest obeyed. Here, in this charred piece of American metal, was a philosophy reversed: dialogue instead of dictatorship. A machine that could listen back. Keller ordered a full schematic drawn by nightfall. By candlelight, Hahn traced the signal path, finding traces of human intention behind each resistor. The Americans had built empathy into their technology. Not just orders, but acknowledgement. That realization unsettled the entire team more than any radar or bomb design they had seen. At 2300 hours, as they powered the transmitter, an unexpected hum filled the room, low, pulsing, almost like breathing. Then a fragment of English emerged. "Check 1-2. You're clear to go." The voice, perhaps from another aircraft or a reflected signal, floated through the darkness like an echo from another world. Bremer laughed nervously. It even answers itself. Outside, rain hit the tin roof. Inside, engineers stood around the device in reverent confusion. Hahn whispered, "We build machines to command. They build them to connect." Keller closed his notebook without replying. His silence said more than any report could. That night, in the officers' mess, conversations circled around the discovery. Some dismissed it as coincidence. Others feared its psychological effect. One officer muttered, "Maybe that's why their soldiers fight like brothers. They hear each other." Keller replied dryly, "Or because their machines remind them they're not alone." Days later, when the first transcript of their findings reached Berlin, the last line startled the reviewing colonel. "Device capable of simultaneous empathy transmission." He crossed it out, replaced it with "device with dual-direction communication." But for those who had heard the machine breathe, the correction meant nothing. They knew what they'd found, a weapon that didn't kill, but understood. As the lights dimmed over the Paris workshop, the captured B-17 radio whispered one last time through static, as if mocking the silence of the men studying it. In that hum, Keller heard not an enemy signal, but a question. What if the future belonged not to those who shouted loudest, but to those who listened best? The captured B-17 radio was now fully reassembled on a steel table under the glow of a single lamp. Hahn ran his finger along the frequency dial, tracing each numbered mark as though reading the pulse of an empire. Keller stood behind him, cigarette trembling between his fingers. The night outside was silent except for the faint drone of Allied bombers heading north. Then the receiver crackled to life, an orchestra of voices layered over static. Short bursts, call signs, laughter, even someone humming a tune before a command cut in. Hahn turned, eyes wide. "Herr Major, they're all on the same band." The discovery shattered everything they thought they knew about enemy coordination. Dozens, no, hundreds, of aircraft sharing one open wavelength without chaos. Hahn quickly scribbled the data. 21.5 megacycles, shared frequency, perfect timing, zero interference. It made no sense. In the German system, strict hierarchy ruled the airwaves. Only officers could speak, and each unit was isolated on its own channel. Here, the Americans had turned discipline into symphony. Keller ordered a reel recorder hooked to the line. As the tape spun, a young corporal named Reiner translated snippets of the chatter. "Tail gunner here, clear on 6. Lead bird steady. Red lead formation. Maintain heading 228. The rhythm was astonishing. Clipped words, confident pauses, no panic. Every man, from commander to mechanic, spoke in the same tone. Trusting, direct, equal. Bremer leaned in and said quietly, "Sounds like a heartbeat." Indeed, the transmissions came and went in perfect intervals, pulses of coordination. Hahn whispered, "They breathe together in the sky." Over the next days, the engineers compiled recordings and traced synchronization patterns. They realized each flight group operated like a single organism, no wasted seconds, no confusion. When one voice ceased, another filled the gap instantly. Their analysis concluded that the U.S. Army Air Forces had achieved what the Wehrmacht never could: collective discipline through shared confidence, not fear. By the fifth night, Keller's notes read like confession. They do not shout, they harmonize. Each voice carries the weight of command and care. Their discipline is born of respect, not terror. One evening, as they listened to another transmission, pilots joking about coffee rations before reporting altitude, a brief pause filled the room. Then, faintly, one airman said, "We're not just machines up here, we listen for each other." For a moment, no one in the lab breathed. Bremer lowered the volume, muttering, "Even at 20,000 feet, they remember to be human." Outside, Paris trembled under distant artillery. But inside that dim bunker, the sound of unseen comrades filled the air. It wasn't just communication, it was communion. A network built not on control, but connection. When the tape finally ended, Keller stood by the window, smoke curling from his cigarette, watching the night sky flare with silent flashes. "We built walls between our men," he said, almost to himself. "They built bridges through the air." He ordered the tape stored in a secure archive, labeled only Brotherhood Frequency. The engineers didn't know it yet, but this single recording would haunt many of them long after the war ended. Because once you hear men breathe together in the sky, you never again mistake unity for obedience. March 1945. Snow still lingered on the roads leading out of Cologne, now reduced to gray skeletons and rubble. Major Ernst Keller's technical team, retreating west with their crates of captured equipment, stopped in an abandoned telegraph office. The building was barely standing, but inside, lines of copper cables hung like cobwebs. A perfect hideout for the last experiment they would ever conduct together. On the cracked wooden floor, Hans spread out the charts they had compiled since Saint-Lô. Dozens of radio intercepts, triangulated and cross-checked, connected across the map of Europe. When Keller saw it, his breath caught. Thin blue lines linked Italy to England, France to Belgium, all converging toward one hub marked Signal Control, High Wycombe. Hahn tapped the center. "Herr Major, this is no ordinary network, it's a continent." He explained that every American airfield, convoy, and radar post was part of a living grid. Messages bounced through portable transmitters mounted on trucks, planes, and even ships offshore. Where German forces relied on railways and road convoys, the Allies moved on invisible highways of radio waves. Keller stared in disbelief. "They built a road you can't bomb." That sentence would be written in his final report, underlined twice. The Germans had devoted entire divisions to protecting physical infrastructure, yet the Americans had shifted the entire battlefield into the air, beyond the reach of artillery. Each transmission Hoffman logged contained a new clue. HQ Greenlight, patch me through to Omaha. Convoy Alpha reports engine trouble near Cherbourg. Meteor Command, divert strike to secondary. It was coordination at lightning speed. A human nervous system stretched across 3,000 kilometers. Bremer added the production numbers: 34,000 field radios manufactured in 1943 alone, 9,200 long-range transmitters, and a logistics chain that could replace any broken set within 12 hours. The comparison with Germany's system, slow, compartmentalized, fearful of interference, was humiliating. One evening, as artillery echoed in the distance, Keller stared at the map and murmured, "They've turned silence into territory." Hahn nodded, almost reverently. "Every signal they send is a step forward. Every reply, a bridge across the dark." In one of the intercepted field diaries, an American operator named CPL James Hollister had written, "We don't march by foot anymore. We march by frequency. I can talk to London faster than I can walk across the camp." For Keller's men, it was more than a technical revelation. It was existential. They had been taught that war was about lines held by blood. But here was a new map, invisible and infinite, where victory traveled not on trucks, but on trust. By mid-March, as Allied forces closed in, Keller gathered his men for the last transmission log. Outside, the sky glowed orange with distant fires. "When history reads this," he said quietly, "they'll say America conquered Europe with machines. But they'll be wrong." He pointed to the radio, its tubes glowing faintly. "They conquered it with connection." No one spoke. The static filled the room like a slow tide, washing over the maps and broken cables. Hahn reached out, turned the dial one last time, and whispered, "If roads are what define empires, then theirs is the first that can never crumble." April 1945. The war was dissolving into smoke. In a commandeered farmhouse near Aachen, Keller and what remained of his unit gathered around their last surviving radio set. The rest of their convoy had been lost in retreat. Outside, the wind carried fragments of artillery echoes mixed with birdsong, a strange duet of death and spring. Inside, silence reigned until Hahn connected the wires. Static filled the room again, thin as breath. They were no longer intercepting enemies. They were listening to the world without borders. Hahn switched to a captured Allied frequency. Within seconds, crisp American voices flowed through. "Blue flight ready, check channel, roger that, proceed at will." Simple, short, flawless. Keller leaned closer. There was no encryption, no elaborate code books, just trust and rhythm. He reached into his satchel and pulled out a worn German cipher manual, one of hundreds distributed to officers. Pages of substitution tables, daily keys, and endless security protocols. Each transmission took minutes to prepare and often hours to decode. Looking from the heavy book to the effortless American chatter, Keller muttered bitterly, We built a fortress out of words and locked ourselves inside. Han, exhausted and pale, replied, "They built a bridge. We built a maze." The Americans had call signs so simple a farmhand could remember them. Red Dog, Blue Lead, Able Fox. The clarity made speed possible. In war, seconds decided life or death. One American logistics report later confirmed it. Their average response time between signal and artillery adjustment was 42 seconds. The German average? 6 minutes. In that gap, battalions vanished. Bremer jotted the numbers and sighed. We thought secrecy was strength, but in a world moving this fast, secrecy is suicide. At dusk, the men shared a last ration of bread and weak coffee brewed from barley. The air smelled of defeat, but also of relief, because analysis had given them something purer than propaganda: truth. Han flipped open a captured notebook marked Signal Manual, U.S. Army Field Version. Inside were hand-drawn diagrams, practical advice, and one phrase underlined twice: "Speed is the best armor." He whispered, "They don't believe in hiding. They believe in reaching first." Keller closed his eyes, remembering his years at the Technische Hochschule in Berlin. Lectures about precision, perfection, purity of signal. Yet, in the mud and ruin of Europe, it wasn't purity that won. It was agility. He wrote in his final field note, "Simplicity preserves life. Complexity preserves pride." Later, a prisoner interrogation transcript revealed an American signalman saying, "We trust our men to speak without asking permission." Keller read it aloud and smiled without joy. That's why they win, because they trust. He looked around the room, faces hollow, uniforms torn, eyes reflecting the fading glow of the radio tubes. "Gentlemen," he said softly, "we've learned too late that the shortest code isn't one of words, it's of understanding." The night fell completely silent except for the static whispering across ruined Europe like rain on tin roofs. Keller wrote one final note for his report before surrendering it to fate. War ends when distance dies. And in that farmhouse, amid the hiss of the ether, the distance between enemies quietly disappeared. Would you have trusted simplicity over secrecy if your life depended on it? Summer 1945. The war had ended, but not for those still wearing enemy uniforms behind barbed wire. Major Ernst Keller was now prisoner number 46217, interned at Camp Gruber, Oklahoma, one of over 400 American camps that housed nearly 500,000 German POWs. The desert air shimmered with heat, and every day at noon, the camp loudspeakers came alive with a familiar sound, the hum of a radio tuning in. Keller and Hans sat beneath the shade of a barrack wall, their tin cups resting on the dust. At first, they ignored the broadcasts, news bulletins, military reports, English songs they didn't understand. But one afternoon, a new program began. A man's calm voice from New York filled the camp. "And now, the sports scores, Yankees 7, Red Sox 5. Good night, America." The sound was almost absurd. In the ruins of their world, someone across an ocean was talking about baseball. Han laughed quietly. "Even in peace, they keep the air alive." Keller didn't laugh. He listened. Beneath the rhythm of English words, he heard something that was not strategy or propaganda. It was life continuing as if war had never interrupted it. That night, he wrote a short diary entry on torn paper. "They speak of games while we count graves, and yet I envy them. Their normalcy is victory itself." Each day, the loudspeakers brought fragments of that normal world: jazz music, weather forecasts, messages from families read by announcers. To men who had lived years in silence and command, these sounds were disarming. One morning, an American sergeant passed by their hut, radio in hand, letting it play for the POWs while he fixed a fence. Han asked, "Do you never tire of the noise?" The sergeant smiled. "This isn't noise, it's proof we're still human." Slowly, Keller began to understand that communication wasn't only a military weapon, it was a cultural bloodstream. The same frequencies that had guided bombers now carried laughter, weather, and small talk across oceans. It wasn't domination anymore, it was connection. He joined the camp's radio class, run by a young corporal named Davis, who believed every prisoner should learn how freedom sounds. Davis let Keller operate the transmitter during lessons. For the first time, Keller heard his own voice travel into open air, bouncing back through static. "Good afternoon, this is Ernst from Barrack 12. It was the smallest sentence he had spoken in months, yet it felt like reclaiming a lost language of existence. In September, a visiting reporter asked to record interviews with POWs for a public broadcast. Keller hesitated, then agreed. When asked what surprised him most about America, he said, "Your radios, not how powerful they are, but how kind." That quote later aired in Kansas City. He never knew how many people heard it, but for him, it marked the moment he crossed an invisible line. From a soldier of silence to a man learning to speak again. In his next letter to his wife through the Red Cross, Keller wrote, "I once built radios to control men. Now I see they can heal them. Tell our son, when he builds, let him build to listen." If you were in his place, sitting behind barbed wire with your enemy's music drifting across the desert, would you have listened or turned away? Winter, 1975. 30 years after the war, the snow outside Dresden fell quietly, muting the city like a soft layer of forgiveness. Inside a small apartment cluttered with old schematics and yellowed reports, an elderly man adjusted the dial of a battered Grundig radio. Ernst Keller was 70 now, his fingers trembling with age, his hearing faded, but the static, that eternal whisper, still reached him. He turned the knob slowly until he caught a faint broadcast from somewhere far beyond the Iron Curtain. The language was English, blurred by interference. "This is New York. Winter advisory." The words came and went like ghosts. Hahn had died years before, but Keller still kept his friend's old screwdriver beside the radio, a relic of their first discovery in the wreckage of that B-17. For decades, he had worked quietly as a civilian technician, repairing radios in East Germany. He never joined the party, never spoke much about the war, but every time a set came to life on his workbench, that blue pulse from 1944 seemed to flicker again. That night, he closed his eyes and listened, not for meaning, but for presence. Beneath the static, he imagined all the voices he'd ever intercepted: American pilots, German engineers, prisoners humming, civilians whispering into the night, cessate, each one layered upon another, forming not chaos, but a strange harmony, the frequency of humanity itself. He thought about the line he once wrote in his notebook at Aachen: "War ends when distance dies." He had meant it as an observation. Now it felt like a prayer. Suddenly, the radio emitted a crackle identical to that first sound he'd heard amid the wreckage, the weak pulse of something that refused to die. For a second, Keller froze. Then, through the distortion, a voice spoke again. "We're still here. Red lead." The same words, 30 years apart. He smiled through tears, whispering, "Yes, you are." Perhaps it was coincidence or an echo from an old recording rebroadcast over shortwave, but to him, it was memory answering back. He rose, walked to the window, and looked at the white roofs of Dresden glowing in the streetlight haze. Somewhere, radios all over the world were speaking and listening, filling the dark with invisible bridges. The same technology that once guided bombers now carried love songs, news, and midnight confessions. Keller touched the glass and said softly, "The machines learned to listen. I only wish we had learned sooner." The static grew louder, like the sea returning to shore, erasing all boundaries. In that sound, Keller didn't hear war anymore. He heard connection, the unending attempt of one voice reaching another through time, space, and misunderstanding. The light from the radio dimmed, but the hum lingered long after he turned the switch off. A sound not of noise, but of remembrance. Because in the end, even silence carries an echo of every voice that ever tried to be heard. In every war, there are weapons that fade and those that endure. The radio outlived the bombs because it carried not destruction but dialogue. Through the static of conflict, it preserved the fragile thread that connected human beings across the abyss. When the engineers of the Reich first opened that B-17's radio, they sought secrets of superiority. What they found instead was the anatomy of understanding, a circuit not of wires, but of empathy. Communication had been the Allies' true artillery, invisible, precise, and unstoppable. Yet beyond strategy, it revealed something deeper, that civilization advances not when we speak louder, but when we listen better. The voice that survived the crash was not merely a military signal. It was a whisper of what humanity could become once it stopped shouting. Keller's journey, from dissecting foreign machines to hearing the heartbeat inside them, mirrored the 23rd. the 20th century itself. A movement from control to connection, from command to conversation. His story reminds us that technology reflects the soul of its maker. When built to dominate, it enslaves. When built to understand, it liberates. Tonight, as countless frequencies crisscross the world carrying laughter, sorrow, and hope, perhaps some faint echo of that 1944 signal still drifts among them. A pulse of endurance, a testament that even amid ruin, the human voice insists on being heard. The War of Steel ended long ago, but the war for understanding never truly does. And maybe, if we listen closely enough, beneath all the noise, we might still hear that same quiet call through time. We're still here.